It's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Kahn from the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, where she's a research assistant. She's also community manager for the Pelagios Project, that she will talk about during the presentation. And we were a colleague in London at the Digital Humanities Department at King's College London, where we both did our PhD. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you, and I leave it to you.
Thanks.
Just as, well, you probably know it already, there is the attendance list going around. We'll pass it, and same.
Thanks, Matteo. It's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. It's I feel like I should say from the beginning that I'm not a classicist, I'm not a historian, and I'm not an archaeologist. So don't ask me any of those questions. My background is in museum studies and specifically cultural heritage digitization. But my role at the Pelagios Project is to act as community manager for collections. So I work with the museums, libraries, and archives who have turned their data into linked data, which they then share with us. And my colleagues at Exeter, the Open University, the Austrian Institute of Technology, and the Institute of Classical Studies, we all work on this project together. Now, officially, I'm here to talk about our linked data exploration tool, but I thought what I would do is just quickly check how many people are familiar with linked data, the concept of it, and how it works. Two fingers. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is perhaps a little bit of an introduction, because it really is essential to how our tools and our project work. And because I'm also not a technical person, I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. If you have difficult questions, you can ask Wolfgang, because he can answer them much more articulately than I can. But basically, the Pelagius Commons is a project which is a decentralized community and infrastructure for linked open geodata in the humanities. So we call ourselves decentralized because we're not an aggregator or a standard. We don't tell people what standard or format to put their data into. What we do is we work to build links between already existing communities of either data producers or data consumers, collections, and projects. And so we try really hard to avoid any kind of central control in the work that we do. And that's both in the way we approach our community and also the way we approach the technology that we've built. We're much more interested in building networks than we are about controlling them. Everything we do is built on linked data, and specifically linked open geodata, which has a URI and which sits within an RDF-based framework. That's very technically sounded, but actually all it is it means that each piece of data has its own URI, or you can think of it as a URL, something that identifies it as an entity, that it can exist within a web of other data. And because we work in the humanities, and primarily with information from the ancient world, we tend to work with classicists, historians, archaeologists, but increasingly what we're finding is we're also working with literary scholars, and librarians and archivists, which I think is actually the most interesting aspect of the work that we're doing. And really what we do is the Pelagius Commons connects data about the past through shared reference to places. So if you can imagine an internet's worth of information and data out there with a variety of different sources, but there's a common denominator of space or place that ties this information together. Something happens somewhere, or someone exists somewhere, or you have a place that is referred to in a source. It's that common denominator of place that we use to tie all this information together. And this data can be and is completely heterogeneous. It has its own descriptions and its own standards. But because of that shared aspect of place or space, we're able to use the linked data format to create connections between these different pieces of information. we see ourselves as being situated within a wider context of linked open data in the humanities, and we're trying to leverage those connections, or as I sometimes think of it, the webbiness of the web, the interconnectedness of it, which allows us to pull entities together. So if you imagine, on the one side, we have resource curators, repositories, databases, collections of texts in libraries, images, or other materials sitting in museum databases. That's on the one side. On the other side, you have what we call concept schemes. These are the systems that provide a URI or a URL, if you want to think of it that way, for different concepts. So that can be a gazetteer, but it's not necessarily restricted entirely to place. So for example, you have people like the Getty who are coming up with description frameworks for people, places, art, and architecture, or the Peripleo Project, which is assigning URIs to temporal events in the time space. And in between, in that kind of middle section of connecting infrastructure and support, is where Pelagios sits. So we take advantage of the webbiness or the linkiness of the web to create these infrastructural connections between the concept schemes on the one side and the resource curators and creators on the other. And these connections are, I don't want to say ephemeral because they're persistent, but they're not permanent infrastructures. We're not saying, here's a box into which you need to put your data in order to make it speak to other data. We're saying, we can help you create links between the boxes that already exist. So how does that actually work? Because it feels a bit abstract at the moment. If you think of gazetteers, sitting at the top there, that's geographic information, which might have connections between themselves. And at the bottom layer, you have historical resources, which also have connections between themselves. We provide the link to connect the one to the other, because annotations or information is not a lot of fun if they sit by themselves in silos. There's only so much that you can do with them. And in fact, one of my colleagues always says that linked data is a little bit like sex. It's okay to do it by yourself, but it's much more productive if you do it with other people. And that's precisely the same for linked data. Like, it gets interesting when you start making connections between things and associate them with other information domains. So if you imagine we're the red lines, we're beginning to make those connections back and forth between the two sets of information. Because what happens is once you can link both ways from one set of information to another, and then back again, it's also possible to start seeing patterns or co-occurrences that allow you to hop back and forth between the sources and the gazetteers. So very quickly, what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to make this very brief only because it's not the main topic of today's discussion. I'll talk very briefly about our annotation creation tool. And then if there's more interest, we can maybe talk about that later or consider running some annotation workshops later in the year if people are interested in this stuff. But I'm kind of going to give a very brief guided tour on how to create linked data annotations. So we created this tool called Recogito, which is a DIY annotation platform. And the code is on GitHub. You can run your own instance on it, or you can use ours. Basically, you sign up, and you get about 200 megabytes of space in which to upload your images or your texts. It's not a repository. It's not a place to store content and make it public. It's a place where we imagine people to be able to create annotations so that they can have a better sense of what they have in their collections. And also, we have recently added the option to upload not only plain text, markdown, TEI, and CSV, but you can also now add IIIF as well. So you can upload a map, an image of a map, you can upload a text, you can put anything that you want in there. So once you've created your account, you upload your information, your source. What you then have the option to do is run the Stanford Geo Parser, which automates some of the annotation or the discovery of the named entities, and which kind of does a first pass of the annotation for you. And this is what your text would look like. You put in your text, the parser automatically finds what it thinks are places or names of people, marks them up in green, and you can then verify, or change those. And if you decide to change it, you can change that marked entity to a person or an event, or you can accept or discard the suggestion that the system has given you. If you choose to discard it, you can then find it manually using the gazetteers that we connect to. And so, for example, here you can see two references to the same place. They're both correct, and they both kind of work within our system in a slightly complicated way of gazetteer alignment and interconnection, which I won't get into now. But you can choose the one that you want, essentially. And then you go through your text or through your map, making the annotations that you want to make. Once you're done, what you can then do is see your information. So you have a map view, and you can look at the rendering of that information and see all the annotations that you have for one place. So, for example, if you look at that example there, you'll see that there are 3 annotations for that particular place, for Heraclea, and it's possible to check back through the annotations that you've made for the one that you're looking for. What you can also do is then download all of your annotations, and you can bundle up the data into CSV. So if there are co-coordinates associated with the places, then you can export those as well, and use it in other geographic information systems that you might want to work with. And that, I think, is when it gets really interesting, because then you can start making the comparisons that linked data really allows you to experiment with. So here, for example, you see 2 itineraries. The yellow one along the bottom is the Vicarello beakers, which are cups from the 1st century, which are inscribed with an itinerary for pilgrims who were traveling from modern-day Cadiz to Rome, and the Bordeaux Itinerary, which is the green one, which was written sometime between the 8th and the 10th centuries. And that's the oldest Christian itinerary surviving, and it describes a pilgrimage of an unnamed devotee from Bordeaux to the Holy Land and back through Macedonia, and Rome, and Milan. And what's really interesting is once you put these 2 things together, even though they may have 7 centuries difference in the time between them, what you can see is all of a sudden you can ask contextual questions of that information, because there are patches of overlap in those itineraries. And we see that despite being from different periods in the ancient world, people take specific roads, people follow specific patterns. What does that mean? And that's when the real kind of digital humanities work of asking questions of the data can come in. And then finally, very briefly, because we believe that sharing is extremely important, and we want to decentralize this work as much as possible, we allow these annotations to be shared collaboratively. So a group of people can work on the same annotation in the same place. Thank you. And we've actually recently discovered that some people at a project called the Lazarus Project in the US, who work on 13th century wall maps of multispectral imaging of these amazing wall maps, they're busy using Recogito to annotate their documents in their groups of 20 people, all working on different layered visions of these old maps. So large texts can be worked on by a group of people. And also everything that you upload, if you want to share with other people, has to be openly licensed. That's the default setting for us. You can sometimes hide those things if there are copyright issues around some of the content, which does happen occasionally. But for the most part, the default has to be open. So that was really speedy, and I left a lot of stuff out. And you feel free to ask me some questions about this later. But I thought that it was important to kind of get the groundwork, because now I'm going to talk about Peripleo, which is the linked data exploration engine, and really what the kind of main topic of today's talk is. So Peripleo is a newish service. We launched it in 2015, and it's a map-based visualization for exploring the relationships between linked open data. How does that work? What does that do? Basically, we have an API which provides machine access to our data. And when I say our data, what I actually mean is the data of all of the partners who have put their data into a form that can be questioned by Peripleo. And the kind of mental model behind this is quite straightforward. It basically consists of entities. So an entity can be a person, it can be a place, it can be an event, it can be a period, and it can also be a data set. And the data sets which we have in the system can also be hierarchical. So for example, a data set can be divided into Latin texts and Greek texts, and Peripleo can still use that data. And also an object like Herodotus's histories can be subdivided into individual books, but the machine can still read through all of those different hierarchies as they exist. Peripleo is Greek for to sail, or we sometimes say to swim around in. And it really, what it does is it offers you the possibility to search through a pool of data that comes from different sources. And in an ideal world, all the linked data that exists out there would be in the same format and would be very easy to query. It would be like using Wikipedia for all the data in the world. But this doesn't work like that. Like as I showed you with the earlier slide with the crosswalking between the maps, between the gazetteers and the sources, what we've had to do is build a layer that sits on top of all the data that's out there in order to create the possibility of those compatibilities. So we have a range of sources. We have gazetteers, such as Pleiades or geonames, or the Digital Atlas of the Roman Empire. We connect to databases like the Epigraphic Database at Heidelberg, or the German Archaeological Institute here in Berlin, the American Numismatic Society, and various others are joining us all the time. This data all has different forms and has different formats, and what we've had to do is create a kind of wrapper around it that makes it easier for people to use it. So we really have curated a collection which can be searched in different ways. You can look for places, for documents, for objects, for keywords. But the point is that it's not meant to be specific, and it's not meant to be exhaustive or to give you exact answers. Because what we realized is that humanities research is fundamentally about interpretation and about association and occasionally about serendipity. And we wanted to be able to help people make those kinds of choices when they search. So Peripleo is really a jumping off point and a way of discovering the distributions, the anomalies, the patterns that you might find using linked data, rather than giving you specific answers. Because we think that you have to start off with what you know in order to discover what you don't know. So if you go to our website, that's where you'll find Peripleo. And I should probably say from the start that what I'm going to show you now is a visualization that's kind of based on a new version of Peripleo, which is being updated literally as we speak, and it's not super stable. So rather than take you into the browser and show it to you and risk having it break, which does happen sometimes, I'm going to show you a kind of simulated version of what that might look like. But I'm going to give you URLs at the end, and everything is open. You can play with the old version, you can play with the new version, you can try and break it if you want to. In fact, I think our technical lead would appreciate that because he likes to test the boundaries of the tool. So yeah, just bear in mind that what you're seeing is really a work in progress. There are a couple of significant concepts behind Peripleo. The first is the idea of record conflation. And what this means basically is that all records in Peripleo are conflated. They're a collection. So every time you look for a place, a person, an object, or a time period, you don't get one specific record back. You get a collection of records from different linked data sources. So for example, here where you see Rome, what you actually see is 3 different versions of a record for Rome from 3 different sources. And what you can also do is you can jump behind that result and have a look at the linked data network behind it, because the Peripleo ingest handles the merging and the splitting of the entities and rewrites those relationships between them as data gets added or updated. So you can see all the gazetteers there. It's a little unclear, but in there you've got Wikidata, and you've got Trismegistos, and you've got a couple of other sources of gazetteer information, all of which are feeding into the same place. One of the other ideas about Peripleo is that a result and a dot are not the same thing. So I'll show you now on the map. The relationship between a mark and a result is not one-to-one. So one dot can represent many items. For example, if you look on the map, there's a very big dot kind of up on the tip of Africa, the Middle East there. What that means is that there are lots of results for the tetradrachm search that you've gotten there, because places are aggregations and not hits. So you're not going to get a one-to-one result when you look for information. At the same time, also, one item can have many dots. So when I showed you the Vicarello beakers earlier, this is that same information rendered in Peripleo. So it's actually one object, but what you're doing is tracing its journey through the annotations. And finally, we've also changed our data model. Now, this sounds technical and complicated. I'm told it isn't, but it sounds technical and complicated to me. The way that the data model used to think about things was that every item had to be connected to a place in order to be part of the system. But what we've done now is that regardless of the nature of the entity, so whether it's a person, a place, or a period, the model is the same. So an object doesn't have to necessarily be connected to a place to be included in our data model. Because the brain, call it the brain that runs everything, is possible to differentiate by type. So instead of having to associate an object with a place, it can recognize an object as an object or a person as a person. And that feels a little bit abstract, and I battled a little bit to understand it, but I'm going to show you an example that I think kind of illustrates this a little bit. If you go into Peripleo and look for crocodiles, you'll get two different types of results. You'll see there's a place, Tel Taninim, and then you'll see there's a result from Herodotus. And assuming that you're not interested in the place, but you're more interested in the idea of crocodiles as they exist in these texts, you can then go and look and see all of the places where in Herodotus crocodiles are mentioned. So if, for example, you look at the results that are related to the Indus River, so where the dot is kind of towards India, what you see on the left are the references to crocodiles and the Indus as they exist in Herodotus. But as you can see, they're not directly related. He's not saying in this river there were always crocodiles. They're just sort of generally related to each other. It's a fairly loose association, but it's enough for us to be able to illustrate it. Likewise, if you have a look at the references associated with Egypt, again, there's a conceptual connection between Egypt and these crocodiles, but it's not a very specific one. This is what linked data does, right? You can make these kind of slightly less specific, but at the same time quite exciting and interesting connections between an idea or an object, in this case a crocodile, and a place. But what I thought I'd do now, because we have how are we doing for time? Are we okay?
We started a bit late. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do now is take you on a couple of simulated journeys through this giant ocean of linked data and show you two ways of looking for information in Peripleo. First one I'm going to show you is how to have a journey which starts from a place. And I think some of this sort of more abstract stuff that I've been talking about might make a bit more sense now. So let's say you're interested in Alexandria, and you go into Peripleo, and in the little search bar you type Alexandria, and up come 2,000 plus results, and you see different references to different Alexandrias all over the world. And you kind of have a rough sense that the one you're interested in is the one in Egypt, so you can scroll through the results on the left-hand side until you find the Alexandria that you're looking for. And there you can see, it's a bit dark, but it's highlighted there, Alexandria, the ancient port city in Egypt, Nile Delta, blah, blah, blah. That's the one you're interested in. So you click on that, and it highlights the dot on the map. Then you can zoom in a little bit more, and you see, okay, so that Alexandria has 10 gazetteer references to it. Those you can see, they're the 3 little colored blocks at the bottom, and then 7 more. And that there are 14,500 odd objects that are linked to it. So now you have a sense of the place, and you have a sense of what's in it. But if I wanted to be absolutely sure that this is the Alexandria that I was looking for, what I could then do is click on what I think of as the linked data logo next to the gazetteers, and I can see the gazetteer linked data points behind that visualization. So you can see Pleiades, you can see Trismegistos, you can see Wikidata, and all of those links are live. So you can click on those from within Peripleo, and it will take you into those different sources, and you can check that that really is what you're looking for. And you can make sure that those references are talking to each other in the same way. We go back to our results. Now that I know that I'm in the place where I want to be, let's say I'm a little bit more interested in filtering the results that I've got, because 14,000 is quite a lot. So if you see just below where it says Alexandria, there's what looks like a little list icon. If I click on that, I'm given more options to filter these results. So I have an option to look by source, by topic, by people, and by period. Now, at the moment, where it says topics, people, and periods, the value is 0, and that's not because they don't exist, it's just because we haven't populated that data into Peripleo yet. But soon, very soon, you'll be able to do that too. But I also have a time span, a very broad time span there. It's massive. But I know that this is roughly the periods in which I'm going to be able to find stuff. And underneath that, I have a list of all the things that have been found, all 14,000 things that have been found in Alexandria that connect to that place in the linked data network. So let's say I want to filter the sources. If I click on the little 4 sources logo, what I see there is a breakdown by where the information has come from. So the American Numismatic Society, the University of Graz, finds.org, which is the UK Portable Antiquities Scheme. And let's say I'm interested in what the University of Graz has about Alexandria. So I click on that, and you can see that the time span between that, when I was filtering by source, and between the University of Graz has changed, because that time span that you see now is where the University of Graz's collection covers. So let's say that I now want to find out what the University of Graz has. I can just click on the first item in that list, and I get a coin and a thumbnail of the coin, and 124 other results from the University of Graz related to Alexandria. But once Peripleo has been populated with people data and associated people data, there'll be a lot more that you'll be able to see there. And most significantly, I think, as well as the little thumbnail and some information about the object, what I have is a link to the University of Graz's database. So I can now jump, clicking on that link, into their online portal and see all the metadata that exists for that particular object. And that, for me, is really where the richness comes in, that it's not just about telling you what was found there, but real detail about what was found there, depending on the different sources that you're pulling your information from. So that's one way of kind of searching this massive linked data by place and refining and refining and refining until you get down to one coin. The other way of looking through it is to start with an object, and slightly more specific than just a crocodile. Let's say we were interested in a tetradrachm. We have a lot of numismatic data in Peripleo, and so this is always a useful example to give people. So if I just put tetradrachm in, you'll see there are a lot of results, again, some 14,000 plus, from 2 sources, and again, covering a very broad time span and a very wide geographical spread. Now, what I can do is that time slider that you see there is not static, okay? You can shift it. You just click on it and drag it along that timeline, and what you can see is not only can you filter by source, but when you start filtering by time slider, the geographic distribution of the objects changes. So at 550 BC, that's where a lot of the data is coming from, but by 330 AD, that's changed. And if we position ourselves somewhere in the middle, because there's a nice spread of dots there, so let's go with that middle period. Now I'm able to look at the sources and start refining my results again. So if I click on the little sources logo in the top left, Again, I see quite an imbalanced spread, lots and lots from the American Numismatic Society, and a little bit less from the Fralin collection at the University of Virginia's Art Museum. And remember, it's not a one-to-one relation, so when the result there says 1 from the Fralin, it doesn't actually mean that there's one object, it just means that there's one aggregation of objects. So I always think it's more interesting to look where there's less stuff rather than where there's more. So if I decide to filter for only the Fralin's collection, then I see that, again, the time slider has shifted. So it's much, much more specific than it was before, a much shorter period and much deeper values. And we have 8 results. So let's say that we decide to then look, of those 8 results, let's go with the biggest dot because it's easiest to see on a screen. And what we discover is in that dot, the location there is Amphipolis. So we have 3 results from that particular time. And again, the time span has become much more specific. There are our results. And let's say we're interested in finding out about the first object on the list. So click on that first object and we see a thumbnail. It's the Tetradrachm of Philip II, and it's sitting in the UVA collection. And again, you can click on that link and then go into the UVA's database and have a look at the much more detailed data that exists for that particular object. So that's a way of doing the search by object rather than by place, and pretty soon you'll be able to also do it by person and by event, which I think is pretty exciting. So we're looking to release the final version of this before the end of the year, in the next couple of months. But really what I wanted to give you was a very brief guided journey through this sea of open data. And if you're going to experiment with this, I think the most important point for me to make is that a query is a starting point. It's a query in Peripleo. If you're looking for a specific answer, it may not be the best place for you to be looking. It's where you start a kind of generalized inquiry. And by following the links and exploring the network of data, you can kind of swim around and find a little bit more. And what will be coming very soon, probably before the end of the year, is a better visualization of related places. So you'll be able to get a clearer representation of the concurrence when 2 places might be related to the same object. So for example, you see here where you've got Athens, what you'll be able to do is see that there are 2,800 items linked there, but also 1 or 2 or 20 or 2,000 related places, which have a connection to another place or an object. Which also means that, like we saw with the crocodile example, there's a possibility to search for items not only by place or by associated annotation, but also within the annotations that connect them. So you would be able to kind of hunt your way through Herodotus, for example, just through the annotations that you found. These are the links. So the one at the top is the current version of Peripleo. It is going to be deaccessioned. What's the word? Decommissioned. It'll be dead by the end of the year. So if you want to experiment now, what I suggest you do is look at the version at Peripleo number 5, which is at the Austrian Institute of Technology at the moment, and where Rainer, our technical lead, is busy updating it all the time. If you're interested in the code, you can find it in GitHub. It'll be there. And if you're interested in the regular updates of it, if you have a look at the waffle.io page, you'll find that information there. The whole project you can find at commons.pelagios.org, and follow us on Twitter. We're hilarious. If you're interested in making annotations, you can have a look at Recogito, obviously the Peripleo link, and again the code if you want to have a look at GitHub. We're funded by the Mellon Foundation, JISC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the Open Knowledge Foundation. These are the credits at the end. And the current Commons committee who run the organization and keep it all together are these people here, one of whom is in the audience with us today. And if you're going to be anywhere near the US in December, the beginning of December, come and join us at Stanford. We're having a big meeting with lots of important librarians and archaeologists and archivists and GIS experts, and it'll be great. And thank you very much. That's about it.